In the sleepy seaside village of St. Mary's Bay, a painter's chilling vision of blood on the quay sparks a mystery that only Miss Jane Marple can unravel. When Eleanor Vernon is found dead on the rocky shore, her death is called an accident. But whispers of a $20,000 insurance policy, a husband's hidden debts, and a locket spared by the tide point to murder. With sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, Miss Marple weaves together clues. A mistaken figure, a nocturnal visit, a trembling confession, to expose a killer in a village where secrets never stay buried. Dive into a tale of greed, deception, and truth, where every stitch tells a story. Chapter 1. The Vision at St. Mary's Bay. The late August sun hung low over St. Mary's Bay, casting a golden sheen across the sleepy seaside village. Cobbled lanes wound past whitewashed cottages, their gardens spilling with roses, while through the deep beda, distant cry of gulls mingled with the rhythmic crash of waves against the quay. The Anchor Inn, a quaint establishment with ivy-clad walls, stood at the heart of the village, its windows open to the salty breeze. Within its lounge, Miss Jane Marple sat by a corner table, her delicate hands guiding knitting needles through a soft skein of pale blue wool. Her eyes, bright and observant behind gold-rimmed spectacles, missed little of the room's quiet bustle. Miss Marple had come to St. Mary's Bay at the insistence of her nephew, Raymond West, a writer with a penchant for dragging his wife, Joan, on impulsive holidays. The couple had left that morning to explore the cliffs, Raymond's enthusiasm undampened by Joan's sighs. Miss Marple, content to let youth chase its fancies, had settled into the inn's chintz-covered armchair, her knitting a pretext for studying her fellow guests. There was Mr. Crosby, a retired schoolmaster who muttered over his newspaper. Mrs. Phipps, the postmistress, who flitted in to gossip with the barmaid, and a scattering of summer visitors, their voices bright with holiday cheer. The lounges, calm shattered when the door flew open, admitting Mrs. Clara Henshaw, a painter of minor renown, whose landscapes adorned the inn's walls. Her auburn hair was dishevelled, her paint-stained smock askew, and her wide green eyes held a feverish glint. "I've seen it again!" she cried, clutching a sketchbook to her chest. The room stilled, heads turning. Blood on the pavement by the quay. Her voice trembled, and she sank into a chair, fanning herself with a trembling hand. Mr. Crosby lowered his paper, his bushy brows rising. "Blood, you say? Nonsense, woman. The quay's clean as a whistle." Mrs. Phipps, ever eager for drama, leaned forward, her teacup forgotten. "What's this, Clara? Another of your fancies?" But Mrs. Henshaw shook her head, insistent. "It was there, I tell you, crimson, spreading across the stones. I blinked and it vanished, but I saw it." The inn's manager, a stout man, named Mr. Tuttle, emerged from behind the bar, his expression one of practised patience. "Now, Mrs. Henshaw, you've had a shock. Let's get you a brandy." He dispatched a boy to check the quay, who returned minutes later, shrugging. "Not a mark, sir. Pavement spotless," the guests murmured, some amused, others uneasy. Talk of local superstitions surfaced. A drowned sailor's curse, a smuggler's ghost. But Mrs. Henshaw's distress seemed too raw for mere fancy. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze resting on the painter. She noted the woman's pallor, the way her fingers gripped the sketchbook, as if it held proof of her vision. "How curious," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying a gentle authority that drew Mrs. Henshaw's attention. "And this was not the first time, you say?" Mrs. Henshaw nodded, her voice steadier now. "Yesterday, too, at dusk. I was sketching by the quay, and there it was, a pool of blood, vivid as life. I thought I'd imagined it, but today—" She trailed off, shuddering. Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind sifting through memories of St. Mary Mead, where old Mrs. Bantry once swore she'd seen a spectral cat, only for it to prove a trick of light and nerves. Yet something in Mrs. Henshaw's earnestness suggested more than imagination at play. "Perhaps," Miss Marple ventured, "you might show us your sketchbook, Mrs. Henshaw. An artist's eye is often keener than she knows." The painter hesitated, then opened the book, revealing a half-finished drawing of the quay, its stone wall, the bobbing fishing boats, and in the foreground a faint pencil outline where she'd begun to mark the phantom stain. The sketch was precise, almost photographic, and Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. The lounge resumed its chatter, the incident dismissed as an artist's eccentricity. Mrs. Henshaw, fortified by brandy, retired to her room, while Mr. Tuttle muttered about overwrought nerves. But Miss Marple remained, her knitting resumed, her thoughts far from idle. She recalled a case in her village, a farmer's wife who'd seen omens before her husband's accident, later revealed as guilt-ridden glimpses of his infidelity. Visions, Miss Marple knew, often cloaked truths too stark for the conscious mind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Miss Marple rose, tucking her knitting into her bag. She stepped onto the inn's porch, the evening air cool against her cheeks. The quay lay just beyond, its stones gleaming faintly in the twilight. She resolved to visit it tomorrow, to see for herself where Mrs. Henshaw's blood had appeared, and vanished. For Miss Marple, whose quiet demeanour belied a mind as sharp as her needles, knew that even the strangest fancies could conceal a very human reality. Chapter 2. The Death of Mrs. Vernon. The morning after Mrs. Henshaw's alarming vision, St. Mary's Bay stirred under a veil of mist, the sea's murmur muffled by the damp air. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl, sat at the Anchor Inn's breakfast table, her toast and tea untouched, as she listened to the low hum of conversation. Raymond West, her nephew, was recounting a tedious tale of yesterday's cliff walk, while Joan, his wife, stifled a yawn. The inn's dining room, with its polished oak beams and nautical prints, buzzed with a new undercurrent of unease. For news had broken at dawn. Mrs. Eleanor Vernon, wife of the retired banker Philip Vernon, was dead. The tidings came via Mr. Tuttle, the inn's manager, who entered with a grave face, his usual bonhomie subdued. "Found on the shore she was," he announced, wiping his hands on his apron. "Below the cliffs, poor soul. Slipped and fell, they say, and the tide did the rest." The guests gasped, forks pausing mid-air. Mrs. Phipps, the postmistress, who had slipped in for her morning gossip, crossed herself. Eleanor Vernon, of all people, quiet as a mouse she was. And to think of Clara Henshaw's blood on the quay yesterday. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained serene. She noted the swift link made between the painter's vision and this tragedy, a connection that spoke more of village superstition than logic. "How very sad," she murmured, her voice soft but deliberate. "Was she alone, Mr. Tuttle?" The manager nodded. "So they say, ma'am. Out for an early walk, as was her habit. Mr. Vernon's beside himself, I hear." After breakfast, Miss Marple proposed a stroll to Joan, who agreed with a sigh, eager to escape Raymond's latest monologue on modern art. The two women walked toward the quay, the mist lifting to reveal the village's pastel cottages and the grey expanse of sea beyond. As they passed the Vernon's cottage, a neat, ivy-draped house with a view of the cliffs, Miss Marple paused. The curtains were drawn tight, a sign of mourning, but a faint light flickered within. A moment later, the door opened and Philip Vernon emerged, his tall frame clad in a black suit, his handsome features etched with strain. He carried a walking stick, though he used it lightly, more for effect than necessity. "Good morning, Mr. Vernon," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing. "We were so sorry to hear of your loss." Philip's grey eyes met hers, and he managed a tight smile, his voice smooth despite the circumstances. "Thank you, Miss Marple, is it? It's been a dreadful shock. Eleanor loved her walks, but those cliffs—" He shook his head as if the thought were too much. Joan murmured sympathies, but Miss Marple noted the man's polished demeanour, the crisp tie, the freshly shaved jaw. Grief, she knew from her years in St. Mary Mead, often left a man less composed. As they parted, Joan remarked, "He seems dreadfully shaken, poor man, but holding up well." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Yes, my dear, but some men hold up a little too well." Her gaze lingered on the cottage, where a neighbour, an elderly woman with a basket of flowers, was leaving a condolence note. The village, it seemed, was rallying around Philip Vernon, yet Miss Marple's instincts stirred, whispering of discrepancies yet unseen. By midday, the village was alive with speculation. Miss Marple, lingering near the tea-shop to avoid Raymond's inevitable lecture on cubism, overheard Mrs. Phipps holding court. Drowned, they say, but her body was battered something awful on those rocks. And after Clara's vision, mark my words, there's more to this. A fisherman, nursing a pint, scoffed. Tide's cruel, that's all. No need for ghost stories. Yet the mention of Mrs. Henshaw's blood-stained pavement had taken root, casting a shadow over the coroner's initial verdict of accidental death. Miss Marple, sipping a cup of Earl Grey, sifted through the chatter. Eleanor Vernon, by all accounts, had been a reserved woman, her life revolving around her husband and her solitary rambles. Philip, charismatic and well-spoken, was liked but not truly known, his London past a subject of vague rumours. Miss Marple recalled a case in her own village, a widow whose accidental fall down a well had masked a darker truth. Death, she mused, was rarely as simple as it seemed. Returning to the inn, Miss Marple found a small crowd gathered in the lounge, where a young constable was relaying details of the discovery. Eleanor's body had been found at low tide, her dark hair tangled with seaweed, her limbs bruised by the rocks. No signs of a struggle, he said, and her shoes, found nearby, suggested she'd slipped. Yet Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively with her knitting, noted the constable's youth, his eagerness to close the matter. She thought of Mrs. Henshaw's sketch, the vivid red stain that had vanished. Was it mere fancy, or had the painter glimpsed something real, a clue to a death now too neatly explained? As the constable left, Miss Marple rose, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. She would visit the cliffs tomorrow, she decided, to see the place where Eleanor Vernon met her end. For in the quiet of St. Mary's Bay, beneath the village's mournful whispers, Miss Marple sensed a thread of deceit, waiting to be unravelled by her patient, unerring hands. Chapter 3. The Village Gossip. The morning mist had burned away by midday, leaving St. Mary's Bay bathed in the crisp light of late summer. The village, though subdued by the news of Eleanor Vernon's death, hummed with its usual rhythms. Fishermen mended nets by the quay, shopkeepers swept their stoops, and gulls wheeled above the slate-grey sea. Miss Jane Marple, her black straw hat tilted against the sun, walked arm in arm with Joan West towards the village's heart, where the tea-shop, a cosy establishment called the Gull's Nest, beckoned with the promise of scones and secrets. Joan, restless after Raymond's latest discourse on surrealism, had leapt at the chance to escape, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, saw opportunity in the village's gathering place. The Gull's Nest was a narrow room with lace-curtained windows and tables draped in gingham. A bell jingled as they entered, and the scent of fresh-baked pastries mingled with the tang of strong tea. Mrs. Phipps, the postmistress, held court at a corner table, her sharp eyes darting over a knot of villagers, a grocer's wife, a retired seamstress, and a young maid from the Anchor Inn. Her voice, low but carrying, wove a tapestry of speculation about the Vernon tragedy. Miss Marple, settling into a chair by the window, ordered a pot of Darjeeling and a plate of currant scones, her demeanour as unassuming as the sprigged cotton dress she wore. Joan, flipping through a magazine, murmured, "This place is positively medieval, Aunt Jane. They're all agog over poor Mrs. Vernon." "People will talk, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with a soft click. "And talk, you know, is often more revealing than it intends." Her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, scanned the room, noting the flush on Mrs. Phipps's cheeks, the way the maid leaned forward, hanging on every word. Gossip, Miss Marple knew from her years in St. Mary Mead, was the lifeblood of a village, and in its eddies lay truths no coroner's report could uncover. Phipps, her grey curls bobbing, was in full spate. "I said to Mr. Tuttle just this morning, it's queer, isn't it? Eleanor Vernon, of all people, slipping on those cliffs she knew like her own garden. And after Clara Henshaw's nonsense about blood on the quay." The grocer's wife, Mrs. Dacre, nodded sagely, her chins quivering. "Queer indeed. My Tom saw her only last week, walking alone, looking like she'd seen a ghost. Nervous she was, always glancing over her shoulder." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her face remained placid. Nervousness, she reflected, was a symptom of many ailments, fear, guilt, or perhaps the weight of a secret. She recalled a spinster in her own village, Miss Lavinia, whose anxious glances had betrayed her brother's embezzlement long before the bank noticed. "Did Mrs. Vernon often seem so, Mrs. Dacre?" she asked, her voice mild as she buttered a scone. Mrs. Dacre, flattered by the attention, leaned across the table. "Oh, aye, Miss Marple. These past months she was different. Quiet, mind you, but not peaceful-like. I'd see her in my shop, buying tea or a bit of cheese, and her hands would shake when she counted her coins. Not like her at all, she was, always so composed, even when Mr. Vernon came down from London." The mention of Philip Vernon sharpened Miss Marple's focus. She sipped her tea, the porcelain cup warm against her fingers, and prompted gently, "Mr. Vernon, I understand, was a banker before they settled here." Mrs. Phipps, seizing the thread, leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "So he says, but there's talk, you know. My cousin's friend in London heard he left his firm under a cloud. Something about mismanaged accounts, though nothing was proved. Came here 3 years ago, they did, and bought that cottage outright. Cash, mind you, which raised a few brows." Joan, glancing up from her magazine, raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like a man with something to hide." Miss Marple's lips twitched, but she said nothing, her mind filing away the detail. A man with a shadowed past, she mused, might have reasons to guard his present. In St. Mary Mead, old Mr. Pritchard had fled a scandal in Bristol, only to find his sins followed him in the form of a blackmailer. Money, or the lack of it, was so often the root of darker deeds. The maid, a girl named Polly with freckles and a nervous giggle, spoke up, emboldened by the attention. "Mrs. Vernon was kind, she was. Gave me a shilling once for carrying her. Parcels. But she didn't talk much, not like Mr. Vernon. He's all smiles, chatting up everyone, though he never says nothing personal. Last month I heard him at the inn, asking Mr. Hargreaves, that's the insurance man, about policies and such. Something about what happens if someone dies unexpected." Mrs. Phipps's eyes gleamed, and she clapped her hands. "There you, see, I knew it. That insurance policy, 20,000, they say, taken out on Mrs. Vernon not 6 months ago. Mr. Vernon insisted, or so I heard from Mrs. Crosby, who cleans their cottage. Not that I'm one to judge, but it's peculiar, isn't it? A woman in her 40s, healthy as you please, and him so keen on ensuring her life." Miss Marple's knitting resumed, the needles moving with a steady rhythm, but her mind raced. An insurance policy, large and recent, was no trivial matter. She recalled a case in her village. A greengrocer named Mr. Stokes, whose wife's accidental poisoning had followed a similar policy, the payout barely covering his debts before his arrest. Motive, she knew, was often dressed in such practical garb. "How interesting," she said, her tone so bland that only Joan, catching the glint in her aunt's eye, sensed the wheels turning. "And was Mrs. Vernon aware of this policy, do you think?" Mrs. Phipps shrugged, stirring her tea with a clink of the spoon. If she was, she didn't let on. But then Eleanor wasn't one for confidences. Kept herself to herself, always, walking those cliffs or reading in her garden. Not like Mr. Vernon, who'd charm the birds from the trees, though I'll say this. She lowered her voice, glancing toward the door as if expecting eavesdroppers. There was a time last spring when I saw them at the post office, and she flinched when he touched her arm. Just a moment, mind you, but I noticed. The seamstress, Miss Tuttle, who had been silent until now, nodded slowly. I saw something like that, too. Sewing a dress for her I was, and she came for a fitting. Her wrists had bruises faint, but there. Said she'd bumped into a door, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. I didn't think much of it then, but now? Her voice trailed off, and the table fell quiet, the weight of implications settling over them. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her thoughts darting to a neighbour in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Harrow, whose clumsiness had masked a husband's temper until the vicar intervened. Bruises and flinches, she knew, were silent cries, often ignored until too late. Yet she kept her counsel, merely saying, "How very sad. A marriage is such a private thing, isn't it?" The women nodded, their faces a mix of pity and suspicion, and the conversation turned to the inquest, set for tomorrow. As they spoke, Miss Marple observed the room's other occupants. At a nearby table, Mr. Crosby, the retired schoolmaster, scribbled in a notebook, his lips pursed as if displeased. A young fisherman, his hands rough from hauling nets, lingered by the counter, listening to the gossip with a frown. And through the window, Miss Marple glimpsed Philip Vernon himself, passing by with his walking stick, his stride brisk despite his morning attire. His face, caught in profile, held a trace of strain, but his posture was erect, almost defiant. She filed the image away, knowing that grief, like guilt, wore many masks. Joan, tiring of the magazine, leaned closer. "Aunt Jane, you're awfully quiet. What do you make of all this?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Only that people are so very interesting, my dear. They say so much and yet so little." Joan laughed, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments. Eleanor's nervousness, Philip's charm, the insurance policy, the bruises, each was a thread, and though the pattern was unclear, she felt its shape forming, like a half-knit scarf taking form under her needles. The tea-shop grew busier, villagers drifting in and out, their voices a chorus of condolence and conjecture. Miss Marple, finishing her tea, listened as Mrs. Phipps recounted a tale of Eleanor's last visit to the post office, where she'd mailed a letter to a London solicitor. "Something about her will, I reckon," Mrs. Phipps said, her tone heavy with meaning. Miss Marple noted this too, wondering what a woman like Eleanor, quiet and unassuming, might have wished to secure in her final days. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple and Joan rose to leave, the bell jingling behind them. The village street was alive with activity. A baker's boy cycled past, a woman hung washing in her garden, and the sea sparkled under a cloudless sky. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts were shadowed, her instincts honed by years of watching human nature in its petty and profound moments. The gossip of the gull's nest had painted a picture, not of a simple accident, but of a marriage strained by secrets, a husband with a past, and a wife whose death had come too conveniently. She paused by the quay, where Mrs. Henshaw's phantom blood had appeared, and gazed at the pavement, its stones worn smooth by centuries of tides. No trace of crimson marred its surface, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on the painter's vision, wondering if it was less a fancy than a glimpse of truth. "Come, Joan," she said at last, her voice brisk. "Let us see what tomorrow's inquest reveals. Facts, you know, are such stubborn things." As they walked back to the Anchor Inn, Miss Marple's shawl fluttered in the breeze, and her thoughts turned to the inquest, where she hoped to learn more of Eleanor Vernon's final hours. For in the quiet of St. Mary's Bay, amid the clatter of teacups and the murmur of gossip, she sensed a crime taking shape, a crime that only patience and perhaps a touch of village wisdom could unravel. Chapter 4. The Artist's Sketchbook. The afternoon sun bathed St. Mary's Bay in a warm golden glow, its rays dancing on the ripples of the sea and casting dappled shadows across the village's winding lanes. The scent of salt mingled with the faint sweetness of late-blooming honeysuckle, and the rhythmic creak of fishing boats at the quay underscored the village's tranquil pulse. Miss Jane Marple, her black parasol tilted to shield her from the light, made her way toward the Anchor Inn with the unhurried grace of one who knew haste often obscured truth. Her sprigged muslin dress, neat and unassuming, belied the sharpness of her mind, which turned over the morning's revelations like a jeweller inspecting a flawed gem. Joan West, pleading a headache to escape Raymond's latest enthusiasm. This time for the merits of abstract sculpture had remained at the inn, leaving Miss Marple to pursue her inquiries alone. The tea-shop's gossip, with its tales of Eleanor Vernon's unease, Philip Vernon's shadowed past, and a suspiciously large insurance policy, had deepened her suspicions. The inquest set for the morrow would likely affirm the coroner's verdict of accidental drowning. But Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing human nature in St. Mary Mead, whispered of darker currents. Mrs. Clara Henshaw's vision of blood on the quay, dismissed by most as an artist's fancy, intrigued her most of all. She recalled a case in her village where a housemaid's ghostly figure in the churchyard had proved to be a lover's tryst, and she suspected the painter's crimson stain might conceal a similar truth. Thus, she resolved to visit Mrs. Henshaw, to probe her memory with the gentle precision she brought to her knitting. The Anchor Inn stood at the village's heart, its ivy-clad walls and leaded windows exuding a weathered charm. The lounge was quiet, its usual hum of voices stilled as guests dispersed to the cliffs or the village shops. Mr. Tuttle, the manager, stood behind the bar, polishing a glass with a vigour that betrayed his unease. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his ruddy face creasing into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Come to see Mrs. Henshaw, have you? She's in her room, still fretting over that blood nonsense. Room 12, top of the stairs." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the nervous twitch of his hands. Superstition, she knew, could unsettle even the stoutest hearts, and Mr. Tuttle's unease suggested he was not as sceptical as he claimed. "Thank you, Mr. Tuttle," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "I shan't disturb her long." She ascended the creaking staircase, pausing to admire the paintings that lined the walls. Mrs. Henshaw's work, each a vivid portrait of the village's soul. One, a study of the quay at twilight, caught her eye. The stones gleamed with a wet sheen, the sky bruised with purple, and the scene held a quiet intensity that spoke of an artist's keen observation. Such an eye, Miss Marple thought, might catch what others missed, even if the mind dressed it in visions. She knocked lightly on room 12's door, and a faint, tremulous voice called, "Enter!" Mrs. Clara Henshaw sat by an open window, the sea breeze stirring the curtains and lifting strands of her auburn hair, now loosely pinned. Her paint-stained smock had been replaced by a simple grey dress, and her green eyes, though shadowed with fatigue, held a spark of curiosity as Miss Marple entered. A sketchbook lay open on a small table, beside a tray of cold tea and uneaten biscuits. "Miss Marple," she said, rising with a nervous smile, "how kind of you to visit. I suppose the whole village is laughing at me by now." Her laugh was fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering, but Miss Marple's warm smile put her at ease. "Not at all, Mrs. Henshaw," she said, settling into a chintz-covered chair with the ease of one accustomed to putting others at their ease. "Your experience has intrigued me, and I've so admired your paintings downstairs. Might I see your sketchbook? An artist's work often reveals more than words." Flattered, Mrs. Henshaw handed her the book, its pages a gallery of the village's life, fishing boats bobbing at dawn, gulls soaring against a stormy sky, the key stones etched with meticulous care. One page, marked with a hesitant hand, showed the key as she'd seen it yesterday. The familiar wall, the tethered boats, and in the foreground, a vivid red smear, its edges irregular, as if seeping from an unseen source. The sketch was stark, almost clinical, and Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. "It's remarkable," she said, her tone so genuine that Mrs. Henshaw's shoulders relaxed. "You've captured it with such clarity. Pray, tell me, what was it like, this vision of blood?" The painter's hands twisted in her lap, and she leaned forward, her voice low. "It was dreadful," she said. "I was sketching just before noon, the light so crisp on the stones. I glanced down, and there it was, crimson, spreading across the pavement, thick and glistening. I felt a chill, as if I'd seen something. I wasn't meant to. I blinked and it vanished, but my hands shook so I could hardly hold my pencil." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with a soft click, their rhythm a counterpoint to her probing questions. "And this was not the first time, I believe?" Mrs. Henshaw's eyes flickered with unease. "No, the day before, at dusk. I was finishing a sketch, the key all shadows and silver. It happened so quickly, a flash of red, then nothing. Thought I'd imagined it, perhaps the light playing tricks. I didn't speak of it then. I was afraid of being thought mad. But yesterday, with everyone watching, I couldn't keep silent. And now, with Mrs. Vernon's death," her voice broke, and she looked away, toward the sea. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, but her mind was alert, sifting through the painter's words. "Such a tragedy," she murmured, her tone inviting confidence. "You were brave to share your experience, my dear. An artist's eye is a rare gift, often seeing what others pass by. Tell me, before this vision yesterday, did you notice anything else by the key? A person, perhaps, or something out of the ordinary?" Mrs. Henshaw frowned, her brow creasing as she delved into her memory. "It's hard to say," she began, her voice tentative. "The key was busy, fishermen unloading their catch, children running about. But, yes, there was someone. A man, I think, in a dark coat, moving quickly toward the lane that leads to the cliffs. I only saw his back, and then the blood appeared, and it drove everything else from my mind." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained serene. A man in a dark coat, she thought, her mind flashing to Philip Vernon's tailored overcoat, glimpsed in his cottage's hall. In St. Mary Mead, a fleeting figure seen by the vicar's wife had unmasked a petty thief, and Miss Marple knew the weight of such details. "How very curious," she said, her tone so mild that Mrs. Henshaw did not sense the scrutiny behind it. "And this man, can you recall anything more? His height, perhaps, or the way he moved?" Mrs. Henshaw shook her head, her fingers tracing the edge of her sketchbook. "He was too far, and it was just a moment. But he seemed furtive, as if he wished to go unnoticed. His coat was long, dark, navy, perhaps, or black. I'm sorry, Miss Marple, it's so vague. After the vision, I could think of nothing else." She hesitated, then added, "I haven't told this to anyone else. They'd say I'm seeing things, especially now, with poor Eleanor gone. Do you think it matters?" Miss Marple smiled, folding, her knitting with care. "Everything matters, Mrs. Henshaw, if one knows how to look. You've been most helpful, and I urge you to rest. Your sketchbook is a treasure. Keep it safe." The painter nodded, a flicker of relief in her eyes, and Miss Marple rose, her parasol tapping lightly as she moved to the door. As she descended the stairs, her thoughts were as precise as her stitches, each detail a thread in a pattern yet to fully emerge. The lounge was empty now, save for Mr. Tuttle, who glanced up from his polishing. "Find what you wanted, ma'am?" he asked, his tone cautious. Miss Marple's smile was bland. "Oh, a pleasant chat, Mr. Tuttle. Mrs. Henshaw is a talented woman." She stepped outside, the village unfolding before her in a tableau of everyday life. A grocer's cart rattled past, a woman pegged laundry in her garden, and the sea sparkled under a cloudless sky. Yet her mind lingered on the key, on the sketchbook's crimson stain and the man in the dark coat. She walked slowly toward the key, her parasol a shield against the sun's glare. The pavement stretched before her, its stones worn smooth by centuries of tides, unmarred by any trace of blood. She stood where Mrs. Henshaw had stood, imagining the scene, the bustling quay, the artist at her easel, the sudden flash of red. Had the painter seen blood, washed away by the sea, or was it a trick of light, a memory distorted by fear? Miss Marple thought of Philip Vernon, his polished demeanour, his strained smile, the gossip of his financial troubles. Had he been at the quay, unseen but for an artist's glance, his presence masked by the village's daily hum? A fisherman mending a net nearby glanced up, his weathered face creasing into a nod. "Afternoon, ma'am. Fine day, ain't it?" Miss Marple returned the nod, her voice bright. "Indeed, sir. Do you work this quay often?" The man, whose name she learned was Tom Bragg, grunted. "Every day, rain or shine. Seen all sorts here, fish, fights, and fools." He chuckled, but Miss Marple's next question was gentle, almost casual. "And yesterday, before noon, did you notice anyone unusual? A man in a dark coat, perhaps, heading towards the cliffs?" Tom scratched his beard, squinting at the sea. "Can't say I did, ma'am. Quay was busy. Market day, you know. Lots of folk about, but no one stands out. Mind you, I was gutting fish, not watching the crowd." Miss Marple thanked him, her smile concealing her disappointment. She knew from experience that witnesses often saw more than they recalled, and she resolved to ask others, perhaps the children who played nearby, whose sharp eyes missed little. As she turned back toward the inn, she passed the Vernons' cottage, its curtains still drawn, a silent monument to grief. A neighbour, an elderly woman with a basket of condolence flowers, emerged from the gate, and Miss Marple paused to exchange pleasantries. "Such a loss," she said, her tone inviting confidence. The woman, Mrs. Lyle, sighed. "Ay, poor Eleanor. So quiet she was, but kind. Mr. Vernon's taking it hard, though he's all politeness. Saw him this morning polishing his shoes like nothing's happened. Men are queer, aren't they?" Miss Marple's lips twitched, but she merely nodded, filing away the detail. Polished shoes, she thought, were a curious priority for a grieving widower. In St. Mary Mead, a butcher's meticulous grooming had betrayed his guilt in a theft, and she wondered what Philip Vernon's fastidiousness concealed. She thanked Mrs. Lyle and continued on, her thoughts a tangle of clues. The sketchbook stain, the furtive man, the whispers of Eleanor's fear. Back at the inn, she found Joan, in the lounge, sipping lemonade and looking revived. "Aunt Jane, you've been ages. What have you been up to?" Miss Marple settled beside her, her parasol resting against her chair. "Only a little visit, my dear, and a walk by the quay. People are so very interesting, aren't they?" Joan laughed, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, turning over Mrs. Henshaw's words. The artist's vision, she felt, was no mere fancy, but a glimpse of something real. Perhaps blood, perhaps a symbol of guilt, seen by an eye trained to capture truth. She resolved to attend the inquest with keen attention, to watch Philip Vernon's reactions, and seek out others who might have seen the man in the dark coat. The quay, with its unblemished stones, held a secret, she was certain, and the sketchbook was its map. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Miss Marple's thoughts were as steady as her knitting, each stitch a step toward unravelling the mystery of St. Mary's Bay. Chapter 5. The tide's secret. The morning of the inquest dawned with a restless energy over St. Mary's Bay, the sea churning under a sky streaked with clouds that promised rain. The village, its whitewashed cottages and cobbled lanes softened by a thin mist, seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting the coroner's verdict to restore its quiet rhythm. Miss Jane Marple, clad in a sober grey coat and her familiar black hat, walked with Raymond West toward the cliffs where Eleanor Vernon's body had been found. Joan, claiming fatigue from the village's incessant gossip, had opted to stay at the Anchor Inn, leaving Raymond to indulge his aunt's request for a morning stroll. His writer's curiosity, piqued by the Vernon tragedy, made him an eager, if somewhat sceptical, companion. "Aunt Jane," he said, his voice tinged with amusement as they navigated a narrow path above the shore. "You're not seriously suggesting there's more to this than a clumsy step on wet rocks? The papers call it a tragic accident, and the village is half convinced Mrs. Henshaw's blood vision is some old smuggler's curse." Miss Marple's lips twitched, her eyes scanning the jagged cliffs below, where waves foamed against sharp stones. "My dear Raymond," she replied, her tone mild but firm, "papers and villages often see what is simplest, but human nature, you know, is rarely so obliging." The cliffs were treacherous, their surfaces slick with seaweed and worn by centuries of tides. The path, bordered by gorse and heather, descended steeply to a rocky cove where Eleanor's body had been discovered. Miss Marple, her parasol serving as a makeshift cane, moved with surprising agility, her attention fixed on the terrain. She had read the constable's report, relayed over breakfast by Mr. Tuttle. Eleanor had been found at low tide, her body battered by rocks, her dark hair tangled with kelp. The official narrative was straightforward: a misstep in the dawns, dim light, a fall, and the sea's cruel embrace. Yet Miss Marple, whose years in St. Mary Mead had taught her to distrust tidy explanations, sought the scene itself, believing it might whisper truths the coroner overlooked. As they reached the cove, the air grew heavy with the scent of brine and damp stone. The rocks, jagged and unyielding, formed a natural amphitheatre, the sea's roar echoing within. Raymond, his hands in his pockets, surveyed the spot with a grimace. "Grim place to end up," he muttered. "No wonder they're calling it an accident. Who'd come here on purpose?" Miss Marple did not reply, her eyes roving over the scene. She noted the tide's retreat, exposing crevices and pools, and a glint of metal caught her attention. Kneeling with care, she retrieved a small object from a narrow cleft. A gold locket, its surface scratched but intact, engraved with the initials EV. Inside, a photograph of a woman, her face serene, stared back. "Raymond, look at this," she said, holding it up. He squinted, his brow furrowing. "Hers, I suppose? Eleanor Vernon's? Odd it wasn't swept away. The tide's fierce here." Miss Marple nodded, slipping the locket into her reticule. "Very odd," she murmured. In her village, a lost brooch had once led to a servant's confession of theft, and she wondered what this locket, untouched by the sea's pull, might reveal. Had it fallen during a struggle, or been dropped by another hand? She filed the question away, her mind as precise as the stitches in the shawl she knitted each evening. They climbed back to the path, the wind tugging at Miss Marple's hat. Raymond, warming to the mystery, speculated wildly. Perhaps she was meeting someone, a secret lover or a blackmailer. You read about such things in London? Miss Marple's smile was indulgent. Perhaps, my dear, but secrets are often simpler than novels suggest. Let us see what the inquest tells us. They returned to the village, the locket a silent weight in her bag, its presence a puzzle she would unravel in time. The inquest was held in the village hall, a squat building, with whitewashed walls and a slate roof, its interior crowded with villagers eager for answers. Benches creaked under the weight of fishermen, shopkeepers, and curious visitors, their murmurs hushed as the coroner, a dour man named Mr. Pendleton, took his seat. Philip Vernon, dressed in impeccable black, sat at the front, his handsome face pale but composed. Miss Marple, seated near the back with Raymond, noted his posture, erect, controlled, the picture of dignified grief. Yet she recalled Mrs. Lyle's remark about his polished shoes, and her eyes lingered on his hands, which clasped a handkerchief with a grip too tight for ease. The proceedings began with the constable, a young man with an earnest demeanour, recounting the discovery of Eleanor's body. Found her at 6 in the morning, sir, just as the tide went out. She was on the rocks, bruised and soaked like she'd fallen from the cliff above. Her shoes were nearby, one caught in a crevice. No signs of anyone else, and the path was muddy, but no clear footprints. Mr. Pendleton nodded, his pen scratching notes. "And her injuries?" he asked. The doctor, a grizzled man named Dr. Haydock, took the stand, his voice clipped. "Multiple contusions, consistent with a fall onto rocks. Water in the lungs. She drowned, likely after being knocked unconscious. Time of death, around 4 to 5 a.m. Miss Marple's knitting, needles hidden in her lap, moved slowly, her mind sifting through the testimony. The doctor's report was thorough, but she noted omissions. No mention of marks suggesting a struggle, nor of Eleanor's clothing beyond her shoes. She thought of the locket, safe in her reticule, and wondered why it had not been noted in the official inventory. In St. Mary Mead, a missing scarf had once pointed to a hasty cover-up, and she suspected the cove held secrets yet unexamined. Philip Vernon was called next, his voice steady as he recounted his wife's habits. Eleanor loved her early walks, he said, his grey eyes meeting the coroner's. She often went to the cliffs at dawn, said it cleared her mind. I was asleep when she left. I woke at 6 and found her gone. When the constable came, his voice caught and he dabbed his eyes with the handkerchief, a gesture that drew sympathetic murmurs from the crowd. Yet Miss Marple's gaze was cool, noting the precise fold of his collar, the absence of shadows under his eyes. Grief, she knew, often left a man dishevelled, but Philip Vernon was immaculate. The coroner questioned him briefly. "You saw nothing unusual that morning, Mr. Vernon?" Philip shook his head. "Nothing, sir. I wish I might have stopped her." His tone was earnest, but Miss Marple's needles paused. She recalled Mrs. Phipps's tale of Eleanor flinching at his touch, and wondered what might have driven a woman to walk alone in the pre-dawn chill. The coroner, satisfied, moved on, calling a fisherman who had seen Eleanor's body from his boat and alerted the authorities. His account added little, and the inquest concluded with a verdict of accidental death, the coroner citing the slippery cliffs and Eleanor's known habits. The crowd dispersed, their murmurs a mix of relief and dissatisfaction. Raymond, stretching his legs, scoffed. "Well, that's that. A sad end, but no mystery, Aunt Jane. Shall we lunch?" Miss Marple rose, her expression serene, but her mind alight. "Not quite, Raymond. There are inconsistencies." She did not elaborate, but as they left the hall, she lingered by the door, watching Philip Vernon accept condolences. His smile was gracious, but his eyes darted, as if searching for an escape. She thought of the locket, the unscuffed shoes mentioned in passing by the constable, and the absence of a coat on the chilly morning. Each was a thread, and though the pattern was unclear, she felt its shape forming. Back at the inn, Miss Marple retired to her room, spreading the locket on her dressing table. Its gold was tarnished, but the clasp was strong, suggesting it had not been long exposed to the elements. She opened it again, studying Eleanor's photograph. A woman in her 40s, her eyes calm, but with a hint of melancholy. Why had she worn it, and how had it lodged in a crevice, untouched by the tide? Miss Marple recalled a case in her village, where a lost ring had betrayed a husband's infidelity, and she wondered if the locket was a token of love, or a clue to betrayal. Over tea with Raymond and Joan, she shared her find, keeping her tone light. Curious, isn't it, that the sea spared this little thing? Joan, intrigued, leaned forward. "You think someone dropped it there, deliberately?" Raymond laughed. "Aunt Jane, you're spinning tales. It fell off her neck, that's all." Miss Marple smiled, sipping her tea. "Perhaps, my dear, but the tide is a thorough housekeeper, and this locket is stubborn." She said no more, but her mind turned to the inquest's gaps. The shoes, too clean for a fall, the lack of a coat, the locket's improbable survival. Each suggested a scene staged, a death less accidental than it seemed. That evening, as the village settled under a sky heavy with rain, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the distant waves. She thought of Mrs. Henshaw's sketch, the man in the dark coat, and Philip Vernon's polished grief. The cove, with its hidden locket, was a silent witness, and she resolved to return. to search for other clues the tide might have spared. In St. Mary Mead, a forgotten glove had once unmasked a liar, and she felt the cliffs held a similar truth, waiting for her patient, unerring gaze. As rain began to patter against the panes, Miss Marple's thoughts were as steady as her needles, each stitch a step toward the heart of St. Mary's Bay's mystery. The locket, she knew, was a key, and with it she would unlock the tide's secret. A secret that might prove Eleanor Vernon's death was no accident, but a crime as cold as the sea itself. Chapter 6. The Husband's Alibi. The sky over St. Mary's Bay hung heavy with the promise of rain, its leaden clouds casting a pall over the village's cobbled lanes and whitewashed cottages. The sea, restless and grey, churned against the quay, its rhythm a sombre underscore to the lingering unease that followed Eleanor Vernon's inquest. Miss Jane Marple, her grey coat buttoned against the damp chill, sat in the Anchor Inn's lounge, her knitting needles moving with a steady click as she pondered the morning's revelations. Raymond West, sprawled in an armchair, flipped through a newspaper, his earlier scepticism about the Vernon case giving way to a grudging curiosity. Joan, recovered from her headache, sketched idly at a corner table, her pencil scratching softly. The inn was quiet, its guests subdued, as if the coroner's verdict of accidental death had failed to dispel the village's doubts. Miss Marple's thoughts were far from idle. The inquest had confirmed Eleanor's drowning, her injuries attributed to a fall on the cliffs, yet the details gnawed at her. The unscuffed shoes, the locket untouched by the tide, the absence of a coat in the dawn's chill. Mrs. Henshaw's vision of blood, coupled with whispers of Eleanor's fear and Philip Vernon's insurance policy, suggested a narrative far darker than a misstep on wet rocks. In St. Mary Mead, a farmer's accidental fall had masked a wife's desperation, and Miss Marple suspected Philip Vernon's polished grief concealed a similar truth. His alibi, that he slept while Eleanor walked, had been accepted without question. But she knew alibis were fragile things, often unravelling under gentle scrutiny. "Raymond, whoa," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. "Would you care to join me for a visit to Mr. Crosby? I believe he saw Eleanor on her final morning, and I'd like to hear his account." Raymond lowered his paper, his brow arching. "Aunt Jane, you're incorrigible. The inquest is over. Why poke at poor Crosby? He's just a nosy old man who saw her from his window." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Nosy old men, my dear, often see more than they realize. Indulge your aunt, won't you?" Joan, glancing up from her sketch, laughed. "Go on, Raymond. You might learn something for your next novel." Grumbling, Raymond agreed, and they set out, Miss Marple's parasol tapping lightly on the cobbles. Mr. Crosby lived in a small cottage overlooking the path to the cliffs, its garden a riot of late roses. A retired schoolmaster, he was known, for his early rising and habit of watching the village from his upstairs window, a pastime that made him a font of local lore. Miss Marple had gleaned this from Mrs. Phipps, whose gossip painted Crosby as both cantankerous and observant, a combination she found promising. They found him in his parlour, a cluttered room lined with books and nautical charts, his wiry frame hunched over a cup of tea. His eyes, sharp beneath bushy brows, narrowed at their arrival, but he waved them to chairs with a grudging courtesy. "Miss Marple, Mr. West," he said, his voice dry as parchment. "I suppose you're here about the Vernon business. Dreadful affair, but the coroner's settled it. What do you want with me?" Miss Marple smiled, her demeanour as soothing as her knitting. "Only a moment of your time, Mr. Crosby. I understand you saw Mrs. Vernon on the morning she died, heading towards the cliffs. It must have been a shock, learning what happened." Crosby's lips pursed, and he set down his cup with a clink. "Shock, aye. I told the constable what I saw. Her, alone, just before dawn, walking that path like she always did, wearing her grey shawl. She was, head down, against the wind. I thought nothing of it till the news came." His tone was firm, but Miss Marple noted a flicker in his eyes, a hesitation that belied his certainty. In St. Mary Mead, a shopkeeper's confident tale had crumbled under gentle probing, and she sensed Crosby's story held similar cracks. "How clear was the light, Mr. Crosby?" she asked, her voice mild. "It must have been quite dim so early." He frowned, shifting in his chair. Dim enough, mist was thick, and the sun wasn't up. But I know her shawl and her way of walking, all hunched like. It was her, no mistake. Miss Marple's needles, produced from her bag, began their familiar rhythm, their sound a soft counterpoint to her questions. "And you saw no one else? No one following, perhaps, or coming from the cliffs?" Crosby's eyes darted to the window, as if the path might offer answers. "No one," he said, but his voice faltered, and he rubbed his hands together. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone as gentle as a vicar's sermon. "Forgive me, Mr. Crosby, but you seem uncertain. A man of your observation, surely you'd notice anything amiss. Was the figure truly so clear in that mist?" He hesitated, his fingers twisting, and Miss Marple knew she had struck a nerve. In her village, a gardener's pause had betrayed a lie, and she waited, her silence inviting truth. At last Crosby sighed, his shoulders sagging. "All right, miss, I'll say it. I couldn't swear it was her. The shawl, the walk, it looked like Mrs. Vernon, but the mist was heavy, and she was far off. Could have been anyone, I suppose, if I'm honest. But I told the constable what I thought, and he seemed satisfied." Raymond, leaning against the mantel, raised an eyebrow, but Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind raced. A mistaken figure, she thought, could mean much. Perhaps someone posing as Eleanor, or a deliberate deception. "Thank you, Mr. Crosby," she said, her smile warm. "You've been most helpful. It's so easy to assume, isn't it, when we see what we expect?" He nodded, relieved, and they took their leave, the scent of roses following them into the lane. Raymond, striding beside her, chuckled. "Well, Aunt Jane, you've muddied the waters now. If Crosby didn't see Eleanor, who did he see? A ghost?" Miss Marple's lips twitched. "Not a ghost, my dear, but perhaps a man in a woman's shawl. Human nature, you know, loves a disguise." They returned to the inn, where the lounge was filling with guests seeking shelter from the gathering rain. Miss Marple, settling by the fire, turned her thoughts to Philip Vernon's alibi. He claimed to have slept until 6, waking to find Eleanor gone. Yet Crosby's uncertain sighting suggested another possibility, that Philip, or someone, had walked the cliff path, dressed to be mistaken for Eleanor. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a husband's illness had masked his presence at a crime, and wondered if Philip's slumber was equally convenient. His charm, his fastidiousness, the insurance policy, all pointed to a man with motives hidden beneath grief. Over lunch, she shared her thoughts with Raymond and Joan, keeping her tone light to avoid alarming them. "It's curious, isn't it, how Mr. Crosby's eyes played tricks? A shawl and a silhouette, and we assume so much." Joan, slicing her roast, frowned. "You think someone pretended to be Eleanor? That's rather sinister, Aunt Jane." Raymond scoffed, but his eyes were keen. "Sinister or not, it's a stretch. Vernon was in bed. Who else would traipse about in her shawl?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her smile enigmatic. "Who indeed, Raymond? But assumptions, you know, are the threads that unravel." Stadion. Afternoon. As rain pattered against the inn's windows, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Phipps, who was sorting mail at the post office. The postmistress, ever eager for a chat, welcomed her with a gleam in her eye. "Miss Marple, come to escape. The damp. The whole village is talking about the inquest. Poor Eleanor, and that Vernon, all tears and polish." Miss Marple nodded, her demeanour inviting confidence. "A sad affair, Mrs. Phipps. I was speaking with Mr. Crosby, who saw someone he thought was Mrs. Vernon that morning. It's strange, isn't it, how the mist can deceive?" Mrs. Phipps's eyes widened, and she leaned across the counter, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Deceive, you say? Well, I'll tell you something. My nephew, young Billy, was out early that day, delivering papers. He saw a figure by the cliffs, too, but he swore it moved too quick for Mrs. Vernon. 'Like a man in a hurry,' he said, though he didn't get a good look. I thought he was spinning tales, but now—" She trailed off, and Miss Marple's needles, produced from her bag, began their soft click. "How interesting," she said. "And this figure. Did Billy say anything more?" Mrs. Phipps shook her head, sorting letters with a clatter. "Not much, just that it was tall, wrapped in a shawl or cloak, heading toward the cove. He was too far to see the face, and the mist was thick. Boys, you know, they notice, but don't dwell." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind alight with possibilities. A tall figure moving quickly could be Philip Vernon, his build disguised by Eleanor's shawl to fool distant eyes. She recalled the locket, its improbable survival, and wondered if it had been dropped in haste, a clue to a staged scene. Returning to the inn, she found the lounge abuzz with talk of the weather and the Vernon case. Mr. Tuttle, serving tea, mentioned a rumour that Philip had been seen at the quay the evening before Eleanor's death, speaking sharply to a fisherman about boat schedules. "Odd, isn't it?" he said, wiping his hands. "Man's wife dies, and he's asking about tides and such." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. Tides, she knew, were key to the cove's secrets, and Philip's interest suggested planning, not grief. That evening, as rain lashed the inn's windows, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. She thought of Crosby's hesitation, Billy's fleeting glimpse, and Philip's alibi, each a piece in a puzzle growing darker. In St. Mary Mead, a wife's sickbed had concealed her role in a theft, and she suspected Philip's sleep was a similar lie. The shawl, the locket, the man in the mist all pointed to a man orchestrating a death. His alibi, a fragile thread she would pull until it snapped. As the clock struck 9, she rose, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. The inquest had closed one door, but others remained, and she resolved to seek out Billy. to probe his memory and to watch Philip Vernon closely. The cliffs, the tide, the blood on the quay, each was a clue, and with her patient, unerring gaze, she would weave them into truth, exposing the husband's alibi for the deception she knew it to be. Chapter 7. The insurance agent. The rain that had threatened St. Mary's Bay all morning finally broke in a steady drizzle, cloaking the village in a silvery mist that softened the outlines of its cottages and blurred the sea's horizon. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and salt, and the quay, usually bustling, lay quiet, its stones glistening under the downpour. Miss Jane Marple, her sensible grey coat buttoned to the chin, and a sturdy umbrella shielding her black hat, sat in the Anchor Inn's lounge, her knitting needles clicking softly as she pondered the threads of Eleanor Vernon's death. Raymond West, restless after a morning indoors, had dragged Joan to the village library in search of a rare volume on symbolism, leaving Miss Marple to pursue her inquiries in the inn's cosy, firelit warmth. The inquest's verdict of accidental, drowning, had done little to quell her suspicions. The locket found in the cove, unscathed by the tide, Mr. Crosby's uncertain sighting of a figure in Eleanor's shawl, young Billy's glimpse of a tall, hurried silhouette. These fragments suggested a carefully staged scene, with Philip Vernon's alibi of sleep a linchpin too convenient to trust. Mrs. Henshaw's vision of blood, the whispers of Eleanor's fear, and the troubling gossip about Philip's financial troubles all pointed to a motive rooted in greed or desperation. In St. Mary Mead, a baker's sudden wealth had betrayed his role in a blackmail scheme, and Miss Marple suspected Philip's polished grief masked a similar calculation. Her thoughts turned to the insurance policy, a $20,000 sum that loomed, large in the village's chatter, and she resolved to learn more about its origins. As she sipped her tea, the lounge door swung open, admitting a man in a damp mackintosh, his round face flushed from the rain. Mr. Tuttle, polishing glasses behind the bar, greeted him warmly. "Mr. Hargreaves, back so soon? Thought you'd be in Plymouth by now." The man, shaking water from his hat, chuckled. "Business, Tuttle. A client in the village needed a policy review. Care for a sherry?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her ears catching the name. Hargreaves, she recalled, was the insurance agent mentioned by Mrs. Phipps, the one Philip Vernon had questioned about Eleanor's policy. A chance encounter, she thought, was often Providence in disguise, and she resolved to engage him. Rising with her umbrella, she approached the bar, her smile as disarming as her sprigged dress. "Mr. Tuttle, might I trouble you for another pot of tea? And perhaps a word with this gentleman, if he's not too weary from the rain." Hargreaves, settling onto a stool, turned with a genial nod. "No trouble at all, ma'am. John Hargreaves at your service. You're staying at the inn, I take it?" Miss Marple introduced herself, her demeanour that of a kindly spinster, though her eyes were sharp behind her spectacles. "Jane Marple, Mr. Hargreaves. I'm visiting with my nephew, but the village's recent tragedy has quite unsettled us all." Hargreaves's face sobered, and he accepted a glass of sherry from Tuttle. "Mrs. Vernon, you mean? Dreadful business. I knew her in a way, handled her insurance matters. Poor woman to go like that." Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone gentle but probing. "How sad. I understand she had a substantial policy. It must be a comfort to her husband, though. No sum can replace a wife." Hargreaves nodded, sipping his sherry. Aye, $20,000, a tidy amount. Mr. Vernon was keen on it, insisted she take it out last spring. Said it was for security, what with their move from London. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, their soft click a counterpoint to her questions. Last spring, you say? He must be a prudent man, Mr. Vernon. Hargreaves's eyes flickered, and he leaned closer, his voice lowering. Prudent, perhaps, but anxious. I met him a few weeks back here at the inn. He asked about the policy, payout terms, what happens if death's accidental, that sort of thing. Called it hypothetical, but he was intense. I thought it odd, but clients worry, you know. Miss Marple's lips pursed, though her expression remained serene. In St. Mary Mead, a grocer's inquiries about arsenic had preceded his wife's illness, and she sensed a similar forethought in Philip's questions. How very interesting, she said, her tone so bland that Hargreaves relaxed, unaware of the scrutiny behind it. And Mrs. Vernon, did she share his concerns? Hargreaves shook his head, swirling his sherry. Didn't speak to her much. She signed the papers, quiet-like, but I got the sense she wasn't keen. Looked tired, if I'm honest, like she carried a weight. But that's not my place to say. He shrugged, and Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. Eleanor's reluctance, she thought, suggested coercion, a thread that wove through the gossip of her fear and bruises. The lounge was filling now, guests seeking refuge from the rain, their voices a low hum. Miss Marple, sensing Hargreaves's openness, pressed gently. You must meet many clients, Mr. Hargreaves. Was there anything else about Mr. Vernon that struck you? A man in his position, leaving London so suddenly. She trailed off, her tone inviting confidence. Hargreaves hesitated, glancing at Tuttle, who was busy with another guest. Well, since you ask, he said, his voice a whisper. There was talk in Plymouth, among the insurance crowd. Vernon's bank had troubles, mismanaged funds, some said, though he was never charged. Came here with cash to buy that cottage, but he's been tight with money since. Asked me once about borrowing against the policy, but I told him it wasn't that kind. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her mind racing. Financial strain, she knew, was a potent motive, and Philip's inquiries suggested a man pressed by debts or ambitions. In her village, a tailor's sudden purchase of a motor car had led to his arrest for fraud, and she wondered what Philip's polished exterior concealed. How curious, she said, her smile warm. You've been most kind, Mr. Hargreaves. It's so comforting to know such matters are in capable hands. He beamed, finishing his sherry, and Miss Marple returned to her table, her thoughts a tangle of clues. The rain intensified, drumming against the inn's windows, and Miss Marple gazed out at the quay, its stones dark and slick. Hargreaves's words confirmed the gossip. Philip's interest in the policy, his financial troubles, Eleanor's reluctance. She thought of the locket, its survival a silent accusation, and Mr. Crosby's mistaken figure, perhaps Philip in disguise. The insurance policy, she felt, was the heart of the matter, a motive that tied the threads together. Yet she needed more. Proof of Philip's presence at the cliffs, a witness to his actions, a crack in his alibi. Determined to test her theory, she sought out Mrs. Phipps later that afternoon, braving the rain to visit the post office. The postmistress, sorting parcels under a flickering lamp, welcomed her with a gleeful smile. "Miss Marple, out in this weather. You're a brave soul, still poking into the Vernon affair, I'll wager." Miss Marple laughed, shaking water from her umbrella. "Only a little, Mrs. Phipps. I was speaking with Mr. Hargreaves, who mentioned Mr. Vernon's interest in his wife's policy. It's curious, isn't it, how such things come to light?" Mrs. Phipps's eyes gleamed, and she leaned across the counter, her voice a stage whisper. "Curious indeed. I told you about that policy, didn't I? $20,000, and him so keen to have it. But here's something new. My friend Mrs. Lyle, who lives by the Vernons, heard them arguing a month back. Through the window, it was late at night. Eleanor was crying, saying she didn't want it, whatever that was. Philip shouted her down, something about no choice. Mrs. Lyle didn't catch it all, but it stuck with her, seeing Eleanor so upset. Miss Marple's needles, produced from her bag, began their soft click, their rhythm steadying her thoughts. An argument, she mused, could mean many things, but in light of the policy, it suggested Eleanor's resistance to her husband's plans. In St. Mary Mead, an overheard quarrel had led to a servant's confession of theft, and she wondered what Eleanor's tears concealed. "How distressing," she said, her tone inviting more. Did Mrs. Lyle notice anything else, perhaps in the days before the tragedy? Mrs. Phipps nodded, sorting letters with a clatter. "She did, now you mention it. Saw Philip at the quay one evening, a week before Eleanor died, talking to old Tom Bragg about the tides. Asked when they were lowest, which struck her odd. Why's a banker care about such things? Tom thought he was planning a boat trip, but Philip never mentioned it again." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind alight. Tides, she knew, were key to the cove's secrets, and Philip's curiosity suggested forethought, not mourning. Back at the inn, she found Raymond and Joan in the lounge, poring over a library book. "Aunt Jane, you're soaked!" Joan exclaimed, but Miss Marple waved off her concern, settling by the fire. She shared Hargreaves's account, keeping her tone light to avoid alarming them. "It's curious, isn't it, how Mr. Vernon worried about that policy? And Mrs. Phipps's tale of an argument, such a sad marriage it seems." Raymond, closing his book, frowned. "You're building a case, aren't you? But it's all conjecture. Where's the proof?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Proof, my dear, comes with patience. Like knitting, it takes time to see the pattern." That evening, as the rain eased and the village settled into a damp hush, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the distant waves. She thought of Hargreaves's revelations, Mrs. Phipps's gossip, and the locket's silent testimony. Philip's alibi, she felt, was a façade, his inquiries about tides and payouts a blueprint for murder. In St. Mary Mead, a merchant's questions about poisons had led to his wife's death, and she suspected Philip's planning was equally deliberate. The insurance policy, she knew, was the key, and with it she would unravel the truth of Eleanor's death, exposing a husband whose grief was as false as the accident it cloaked. Chapter 8. The Nighttime Encounter. The drizzle that had cloaked St. Mary's Bay throughout the day gave way to a clear, cool evening, the sky a deep indigo pricked with stars. The village, its cobbled lanes slick with rain, gleamed faintly under the glow of gas lamps, and the sea whispered against the quay, a restless murmur that echoed the unease lingering after Eleanor Vernon's inquest. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a dark shawl that blended with the shadows, stood on the Anchor Inn's porch, her eyes fixed on the Vernon's cottage across the lane. The inn's lounge, abuzz with evening chatter, held no appeal tonight. Her mind, sharpened by the day's revelations, sought the quiet of the night to test a growing suspicion. The insurance agent's account of Philip Vernon's anxious inquiries, coupled with Mrs. Phipps's tale of a heated argument, and Philip's interest in tides, had tightened the web around Eleanor's death. The locket unscathed by the sea, Mr. Crosby's uncertain sighting, young Billy's glimpse of a tall figure, each was a thread in a pattern Miss Marple now saw clearly. A murder disguised as an accident, driven by a $20,000 policy and a husband's hidden desperation. In St. Mary Mead, a chemist's nocturnal wanderings had betrayed his role in a poisoning, and she wondered if Philip, too, might reveal himself under the cover of darkness. Thus she resolved to watch the cottage, to see if the widower's grief held firm when he thought himself unobserved. The inn's clock struck 9, its chimes muffled by the night's damp air. Miss Marple, her knitting left behind to avoid detection, slipped into the lane, her steps soft on the cobbles. The village was settling. Windows glowed with lamplight, and the scent of wood smoke hung heavy. She positioned herself near a low wall opposite the Vernon's cottage, where a gnarled apple tree offered concealment. The cottage was dark, its curtains drawn, but a faint flicker of light escaped through a gap, suggesting movement within. Miss Marple's heart beat steadily, her years of quiet observation lending her the patience of a hunter. She recalled a night in her village, watching a poacher's lantern betray his path, and knew that men, even clever ones, often faltered in solitude. Minutes passed, the village's sounds fading to a hush. A dog barked in the distance, and a fisherman's boots clattered briefly by the quay. Then the cottage door opened, and Philip Vernon emerged, his tall frame unmistakable even in the dim light. He wore a dark overcoat, its collar turned up, and carried no lantern, as if wary of being seen. He glanced left and right, his movements deliberate, before setting off toward the cliff path, his stride brisk but silent. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her suspicions confirmed. A grieving husband, she thought, had little reason to roam the cliffs at night, unless those cliffs held secrets he feared exposed. She followed at a distance, her small figure blending with the shadows of hedges and walls. The path to the cliffs was narrow, bordered by gorse and bracken, and the sea's roar grew louder as they climbed. Philip's pace was steady, his head bowed as if deep in thought, and Miss Marple, her parasol left at the inn, relied on her sure footing to keep up. The night was clear, the moon a thin crescent that cast faint light on the path, enough for her to track his silhouette without being seen. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a vicar's late-night walk had led to a hidden cache of stolen silver, and she wondered what Philip sought, or sought to conceal. The path opened to the cliff's edge, where the cove lay below, its rocks jagged in the moonlight. Philip stopped at the spot where Eleanor's body had been found, his figure stark against the sea's glimmer. He stood motionless, staring down at the rocks, and Miss Marple, slipping behind a boulder, watched closely. His posture was not one of grief, no bowed shoulders, no trembling hands, but of calculation, as if measuring the scene. He knelt briefly, his hands brushing the ground, perhaps searching for something lost or ensuring nothing remained. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind flashing to the locket, its survival a clue to a staged death. Had Philip dropped it in haste, or was he now seeking another trace of his crime? He rose, his movements abrupt, and turned back toward the village, his face caught briefly in the moonlight. Miss Marple held her breath, her body pressed against the boulder's cold surface. His expression, etched with tension, held no trace of sorrow, only a wary alertness that spoke of guilt. In St. Mary Mead, a grocer's furtive glance had betrayed his theft, and she knew Philip's nighttime errand was no innocent pilgrimage. As he passed within yards of her hiding place, she noted his hands, clenched tightly, and the faint glint of a ring on his finger. A detail she filed away, knowing small things often unlocked great truths. She waited until his footsteps faded, then emerged, her shawl damp with mist. The cliff's edge was treacherous, but she approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the spot where Philip had knelt. The ground was soft from rain, marked by his footprints, but nothing else caught her eye. No dropped object, no disturbed earth. Yet his presence here, so soon after the inquest, confirmed her belief. The cove was no mere accident site, but a stage for murder, and Philip was its director. She recalled young Billy's tale of a tall figure in a shawl, and Mrs. Phipps's account of Philip's tide inquiries, each a piece in a puzzle now taking shape. Returning to the village, she took a different path, skirting the quay to avoid detection. The night was still, save for the sea's low moan, and the village slept, its secrets locked behind shuttered windows. Miss Marple's thoughts were as precise as her knitting, each detail a stitch in a pattern of deceit. Philip's alibi, his sleep while Eleanor walked, was a lie, she felt certain, supported by his nocturnal visit to the cliffs. In St. Mary Mead, a farmer's midnight chores had masked his sabotage of a rival's crops, and she suspected Philip's errand was equally deliberate, a check on his crime's traces, or a search for evidence left behind. Back at the inn, she slipped into the lounge, where a few late guests lingered over brandy. Mr. Tuttle, locking the bar, nodded to her. "Late night, Miss Marple. Mind the damp. It's a chilly one." She smiled, her demeanour unruffled. "Just a breath of air, Mr. Tuttle. The village is so peaceful at night." He chuckled, unaware of her vigil, and she climbed to her room, her heart steady, but her mind alight. Settling by her window, she gazed at the Vernon's cottage, now dark, and considered her next move. Philip's actions, she knew, must be exposed, but she needed a witness, a slip, a crack in his carefully crafted façade. The next morning, over breakfast, she shared a sanitized version of her outing with Raymond and Joan, framing it as a stroll gone long. "The cliffs are lovely by moonlight," she said, buttering her toast, "but so treacherous, don't you think? One wonders why anyone would walk there at night." Raymond, slicing his bacon, laughed. "Aunt Jane, you're fishing for drama. Probably just lovers or smugglers." Joan, more perceptive, frowned. "You saw something, didn't you? You've that look." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled, but she said nothing, her thoughts on Philip's tense face, his searching hands. Determined to press further, she visited Mrs. Lyle, the Vernon's neighbour, whose earlier gossip about their argument had proved valuable. Mrs. Lyle, tending her roses, welcomed her with a cup of tea in her cramped parlour. "Miss Marple, still sleuthing, are you? The village can't stop talking about poor Eleanor." Miss Marple smiled, her tone gentle. "Only curious, Mrs. Lyle. I was thinking of your story about the Vernon's quarrel. Did you ever notice Mr. Vernon out late, perhaps walking the cliffs?" Mrs. Lyle's eyes widened, and she set down her cup. "Now you mention it, I did. A few nights before Eleanor died, I was up late with my rheumatism, and I saw him leave the cottage near midnight. No lantern, just that dark coat of his, heading toward the cliffs. I thought it queer, but he's a restless sort, isn't he?" Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. Another thread, she thought, tying Philip to the cliffs. His nocturnal habits a pattern of suspicion. In St. Mary Mead, a butcher's late-night walks had led to his arrest for arson, and she felt Philip's wanderings were no less damning. Returning to the inn, she found the lounge abuzz with a new rumour, sparked by a fisherman's tale. Tom Bragg, over pints at the bar, claimed he'd seen a man and woman arguing by the cliffs days before Eleanor's death, their voices raised in anger. "Couldn't see their faces," he said, "but the man was tall, and she was in a shawl, like Mrs. Vernon's." Miss Marple, listening from her corner, noted the detail, her mind linking it to Philip's nighttime visit. An argument, witnessed but not identified, could be the key to unravelling his alibi, if only she could place him there. As evening fell, the village settling into a quiet hush, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting a steady rhythm. She thought of Philip's moonlit vigil, Mrs. Lyle's sighting, and Tom's tale of a quarrel. Each was a clue, pointing to a man whose grief was a mask, his nighttime encounter a silent confession. In St. Mary Mead, a merchant's secret meeting had exposed his fraud, and she knew Philip's actions, if pressed, would betray him. She resolved to set a trap, to stir the village's whispers and watch his reaction, certain that fear would unravel the husband whose alibi was as fragile as the tide's secrets. Chapter 9. The trap. The morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary's Bay, casting a pale, hopeful light across the village's rain-washed lanes and glistening quay. The sea, calmed after days of restless churning, lapped gently against the stones, and the air carried a fresh tang of salt and damp grass. Miss Jane Marple, her grey coat exchanged for a lighter shawl in deference to the milder weather, sat in the Anchor Inn's lounge, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The inn was alive with the comings and goings of guests, their voices a low hum of condolence and conjecture about Eleanor Vernon's death, now officially an accident, but unofficially a source of endless speculation. Raymond West, poring over a manuscript at a nearby table, occasionally muttered about narrative arcs, while Joan, sketching the key from memory, glanced up with a smile, sensing her aunt's preoccupation. Miss Marple's mind was far from idle, weaving the threads of the case into a pattern that grew ever clearer. Philip Vernon's nighttime visit to the cliffs, witnessed in the moonlight, had confirmed her suspicion. His alibi of sleep was a lie, his grief a performance. The locket, unscathed by the tide, Mr. Crosby's mistaken figure, young Billy's tall silhouette, the insurance agent's tale of Philip's anxious inquiries, Mrs. Lyle's account of his nocturnal wanderings, and Tom Bragg's overheard argument, all pointed to a murder orchestrated for profit, cloaked in the guise of a tragic fall. In St. Mary Mead, a shopkeeper's calculated kindness had masked his theft, and Miss Marple knew Philip's charm. was a similar veneer, hiding a motive rooted in the 20,000 policy. Yet proof remained elusive, and she resolved to set a trap, to stir the village's whispers and provoke a reaction that would betray the widower's guilt. Her plan was simple but precise, born of years observing human nature's frailties. She would plant a rumour, subtle but pointed, suggesting a witness had seen a man pushing a woman toward the cliffs on the morning of Eleanor's death. Fear, she knew, was a potent unraveller, and a guilty man, hearing such a tale, might falter, revealing his hand through panic or denial. In her village, a whispered hint of a seen theft had flushed out a culprit, and she trusted the same tactic would work here. Turning to Raymond, she lowered her voice, her tone casual but deliberate. "Raymond, my dear, would you do your aunt a small favour? At lunch, when the lounge is full, mention quite offhand that you heard a fisherman claim he saw a man and woman struggling by the cliffs at dawn, the day Mrs. Vernon died. Don't say who, just let it spread." Raymond's pen paused, his eyes narrowing with a mix of amusement and suspicion. "Aunt Jane, you're plotting something, aren't you? This sounds like one of my novels, sowing discord to catch a villain." He grinned, but Miss Marple's smile was serene, her needles never faltering. "Only a little experiment, my dear. People talk, and talk reveals so much. Will you do it?" Joan, overhearing, leaned forward, her sketch forgotten. "Oh, Raymond, do it! It's positively thrilling. But, Aunt Jane, what are you hoping for?" Miss Marple's eyes crinkled, but she merely said, "Clarity, Joan. Like a pattern in knitting, it comes with the right twist." Raymond, ever game for a lark, agreed, and at noon, as the lounge filled with villagers and guests, he played his part. Over soup, he leaned toward Mr. Tuttle, who was serving, and said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "Heard a queer thing this morning, Tuttle. A fisherman down at the quay swears he saw a man pushing a woman toward the cliffs at dawn, the day Mrs. Vernon died. Didn't catch his name, but it's got me wondering." He shrugged, returning to his meal, but the words landed like a stone in a still pond. Mr. Tuttle's eyes widened, and he bustled off, whispering to a barmaid. Mrs. Phipps at a corner table perked up, her teacup clattering, while a group of fishermen exchanged glances, their voices rising with speculation. Miss Marple, seated by the window with her knitting, watched the ripples spread. The rumour, vague but potent, took root, and by the time pudding was served, the lounge buzzed with hushed theories. She noted Philip Vernon's arrival, his black suit impeccable, as he joined a table of sympathizers, his smile strained but gracious. His eyes, however, darted toward the whispering groups, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of unease cross his face, quickly masked by a sip of wine. In St. Mary Mead, a baker's nervous laugh had betrayed his guilt when rumours of a theft surfaced, and she knew Philip's composure was a fragile thing, stretched thin by fear. The afternoon saw the rumour grow, carried by Mrs. Phipps to the post office and Tom Bragg to the quay. Miss Marple, strolling with Joan to the village shop, overheard snippets. A grocer's wife wondering if the witness was reliable. A maid speculating about a lover's quarrel. Joan, catching the mood, murmured, "Aunt Jane, you've stirred a hornet's nest. The whole village is alight. Do you think Mr. Vernon heard?" Miss Marple's lips pursed, her shawl adjusting slightly against the breeze. "Oh, I'm certain he has, my dear. And men, you know, are never so careful when they're afraid." Back at the inn, she observed Philip closely, lingering in the lounge as he dined alone, his fork moving mechanically. His charm, usually effortless, was fraying, his smile too quick, his replies to well-wishers curt. When Mrs. Phipps, unable to resist, approached with a "Have you heard, Mr. Vernon, about this fisherman's tale?" his face tightened, and he laughed a sharp, brittle sound. "Village nonsense, Mrs. Phipps. People see what they want to see." But his hand, gripping his glass, trembled, and Miss Marple, knitting quietly, noted the sweat on his brow. Fear, she thought, was doing its work, loosening the threads of his façade. Determined to press her advantage, she sought out young Billy, Mrs. Phipps's nephew, whose glimpse of a tall figure had bolstered her suspicions. She found him by the quay, tossing stones into the sea, his freckled face brightening at her approach. "Miss Marple, Ma says you're asking questions, like a detective." She laughed, her tone warm. "Only curious, Billy. You told your aunt about a figure by the cliffs, the morning Mrs. Vernon died. Can you remember anything more? It's so important to be precise." Billy squinted, kicking a pebble. "Not much, Mum. It was misty, and I was hurrying with papers. Tall, like a man, but wearing a shawl or cloak, moving fast toward the cove. Didn't see no face, but it wasn't Mrs. Vernon's walk. She was slower, kinda careful." Miss Marple nodded, slipping him a shilling for his trouble. His account, though vague, aligned with Mr. Crosby's uncertainty and Tom Bragg's tale of an argument painting a picture of a man, likely Philip, disguised to deceive. In St. Mary Mead, a boy's sighting of a ghost had led to a smuggler's arrest, and she trusted Billy's sharp eyes. Returning to the inn, she considered her trap's progress. The rumour had unsettled Philip, but she needed a final push, a confrontation that would force his hand. She recalled a case in her village where a whispered accusation had prompted a confession, and resolved to orchestrate a gathering where the village's suspicions could confront Philip directly. "That evening," she confided in Raymond, outlining her plan. "Tomorrow, my dear, I'd like to invite a few key villagers, Mrs. Henshaw, Mrs. Phipps, Mr. Tuttle, and, of course, Mr. Vernon, to the lounge for tea. A little gathering to discuss the tragedy, nothing formal. Will you help arrange it?" Raymond, intrigued, agreed, his writer's flair for drama ignited. "Aunt Jane, this is positively Machiavellian. You're setting a stage, aren't you? What's the play?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Only truth, Raymond, like a dropped stitch. It shows when you tug the right thread. The invitation was issued through Mr. Tuttle, who spread the word with his usual gusto, framing it as a chance to honour Eleanor's memory. By dusk, the village buzzed with anticipation, the rumour of the fisherman's witness now a firestorm, with some claiming the man was a stranger, others whispering Philip's name. Miss Marple, watching from her window, saw Philip pass the inn, his stride faltering as he overheard two fishermen debating the tale. His face, caught in the lamplight, was pale, his eyes haunted, and she knew her trap was set. In St. Mary Mead, a merchant's panic at a rumour had led to his flight, and she sensed Philip was nearing a similar breaking point. As night fell, the village settling into a quiet hush, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. She thought of Philip's trembling hand, Billy's testimony, and the locket's silent accusation. The trap, she felt, was ready, its jaws poised to close. Tomorrow, in the lounge's warm glow, she would weave the village's suspicions into a net, drawing out Philip's guilt with the precision of a needle through wool. In St. Mary Mead, a whispered hint had unmasked a liar, and she was certain that here, in St. Mary's Bay, the truth would surface, exposing a husband whose alibi was as false as the accident it concealed. Chapter 10. The Confession. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the Anchor Inn's lounge, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak tables and chintz-covered chairs. St. Mary's Bay, fresh from yesterday's rain, sparkled under a sky of unbroken blue, its cobbled lanes alive with the chatter of fishermen and the clatter of market carts. Yet within the inn, a hushed anticipation hung heavy, as if the village's collective breath awaited the outcome of Miss Jane Marple's carefully orchestrated gathering. Her knitting lay folded in her bag, a rare absence. For today, her hands were still, her mind as sharp as the needles she wielded. She sat by a window overlooking the quay, her grey shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her eyes bright behind gold-rimmed spectacles, watching the guests arrive for the tea she had arranged. The trap set yesterday, Raymond's rumour of a fisherman witnessing a man pushing a woman toward the cliffs, had spread like wildfire, unsettling Philip Vernon's polished façade. His strained smile, his trembling hand, and his curt replies had betrayed a man teetering on the edge of panic. Miss Marple, with her years of observing human nature in St. Mary Mead, knew that guilt, when pressed, often cracked under the weight of fear. The locket, the mistaken figure in Eleanor's shawl, the insurance policy, Philip's nocturnal visit to the cliffs, and the whispered argument by the cove, all formed a tapestry of deceit, with Philip at its centre. Today she would pull the final thread, weaving the village's suspicions into a confrontation that would force his confession. The lounge filled slowly, its atmosphere charged with curiosity. Mr. Tuttle, bustling with trays of tea and scones, had spread the invitation as a chance to honour Eleanor Vernon, though his knowing glance at Miss Marple suggested he sensed more. Mrs. Phipps arrived first, her grey curls bouncing as she settled at a central table, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of drama. Mrs. Clara Henshaw followed, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her sketchbook clutched like a talisman, her nervous smile betraying her unease at being included. Tom Bragg the fisherman came next, his weathered face creased with suspicion, drawn by the rumour's echo. Mrs. Lyle, the Vernon's neighbour, slipped in quietly, her basket of roses left at home, her expression one of cautious intrigue. Philip Vernon entered last, his black suit immaculate, his handsome features set in a mask of polite sorrow, though Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his hands flexed at his sides. Raymond and Joan, at Miss Marple's request, took seats near the door, their presence a subtle support. Raymond, his writer's curiosity piqued, whispered to Joan, "Aunt Jane's staging a scene straight from a thriller. I almost pity Vernon." Joan, her sketchpad closed, murmured, "Pity him? If she's right, he's a monster." Miss Marple, catching their exchange, allowed a faint smile, her demeanour as serene as a vicar's wife at a parish tea. Yet her mind was a steel trap, each detail of the case aligned like stitches in a flawless row. She rose, her voice gentle but carrying, drawing the room's attention. "My dear friends," she began, "thank you for joining me. I thought it fitting, after such a tragedy, to reflect on Mrs. Vernon's life and the sad circumstances of her passing. The inquest has called it an accident, but villages, you know, have long memories and sharp eyes." Her tone was mild, but her words landed with precision, and Philip's smile tightened, his eyes flicking toward the door. Mrs. Phipps nodded eagerly, while Mrs. Henshaw's fingers tightened on her sketchbook, sensing the undercurrent. Miss Marple continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "There are curiosities, aren't there? Small things that linger, like a dropped stitch in a shawl. Mrs. Vernon's shoes, for instance, so clean, despite a fall on jagged rocks, and her locket, found in a crevice, untouched by the tide's sweep." She paused, letting the words settle, and saw Philip's hand clench, his knuckles whitening. "Then there's the figure seen by Mr. Crosby, thought to be Mrs. Vernon, but perhaps not in that dim, misty dawn. And young Billy's glimpse of a tall figure moving too swiftly for a woman's gait. The room stirred, murmurs rising. Tom Bragg shifted, his voice gruff. "Aye, and that talk of a man and woman arguing by the cliffs days before. I heard 'em myself, though I couldn't see clear." Mrs. Phipps leaned forward, her teacup forgotten. "And that insurance policy, $20,000, taken out so sudden. I said it was queer, didn't I?" Philip's face paled, but he forced a laugh, his voice smooth despite the strain. "Village gossip, Miss Marple. Surely you don't credit such tales? Eleanor's death was a tragedy, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes met his, steady and unyielding, though her smile remained gentle. "Gossip, Mr. Vernon, often holds a grain of truth. Let us consider. A wife, nervous, bruised, reluctant to sign a policy her husband pressed upon her. A husband asking about tides and payouts, seen at the cliffs by night, as Mrs. Lyle can attest." Mrs. Lyle gasped, nodding, and Philip's jaw tightened, his charm fraying. "And then," Miss Marple continued, "a rumour. A fisherman claiming he saw a man pushing a woman toward the cliffs at dawn. Such a story, if true, changes everything." The lounge fell silent, the weight of her words pressing against Philip's. Composure. He rose, his laugh harsh, his eyes darting. "This is absurd. You're weaving fancies, Miss Marple, to tarnish my wife's memory. I was asleep when Eleanor left. I've said so, and the coroner believed me." His voice rose, and Miss Marple noted the desperation in it, the crack in his alibi's armour. In St. Mary Mead, a merchant's outburst had betrayed his fraud, and she knew Philip was close to breaking. Before she could speak, Mrs. Henshaw, trembling, stood, her voice quavering but firm. "I saw you, Mr. Vernon, that morning before my vision of blood near the quay. You were wiping your hands, red like blood, though I didn't understand then. I thought it was my mind, but it was you." The room gasped, and Philip's face drained of colour, his hands gripping the table. "Lies!" He shouted, but his voice shook, and Miss Marple's gaze held him, calm and relentless. "Mrs. Henshaw's eyes keen," she said softly, "and artists see what others miss. Let us suppose, Mr. Vernon, that you did not sleep that morning. Suppose you lured Eleanor to the cliffs, dressed in her shawl to fool distant eyes like Mr. Crosby's. Suppose you drowned her in shallow water, staging her fall but dropped her locket in haste. The tide spared it, and your hands, perhaps cut, in the struggle left a trace Mrs. Henshaw saw, a trace you washed away, but not from her memory. Philip's laugh was a snarl, his eyes wild. "You've no proof! This is slander, spun from nothing!" But his voice cracked and he swayed, his hand clutching the chair. Miss Marple's tone never wavered. "Proof, Mr. Vernon, lies in patterns. Your questions about the policy, your argument overheard by Mrs. Lyle, your interest in tides, your presence at the cliffs by night, all weave a pattern of guilt. And fear, you see, makes even clever men careless." The room was still, every eye on Philip. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his shoulders slumping. "It wasn't meant to," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "The debts! They were crushing us. She wouldn't listen, wouldn't. See, we had no choice." His words faltered, and he sank into his chair, his face buried in his hands. The lounge erupted in gasps, Mrs. Phipps clutching her heart, Tom Bragg muttering a curse. Miss Marple remained seated, her expression one of quiet sorrow, though her mind was clear. In St. Mary Mead, a wife's whispered confession had closed a case, and here Philip's collapse was the final stitch. Raymond, at Miss Marple's nod, slipped out to fetch the constable, who had been discreetly alerted by Mr. Tuttle. The officer, a burly man with a stern face, arrived swiftly, his notebook open. Philip, his voice hollow, muttered of debts and desperation, his charm shattered. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he said as the constable led him away. "It was the money, always the money." The guests dispersed, their voices a mix of shock and vindication, leaving Miss Marple with Mrs. Henshaw, who wept softly, her sketchbook open to the blood-stained key. "You were brave, my dear," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "Your vision was no fancy, but a truth your heart saw." Mrs. Henshaw nodded, her tears falling, and Miss Marple rose, her shawl adjusted with care. The lounge was quiet now, the tea cold, but the air felt lighter, as if the village had exhaled. She thought of Eleanor, her quiet life ended by greed, and of Philip, whose cleverness had been no match for the simple truths of human nature. As she stepped outside, the key sparkled under the sun, its stones clean and unblemished. Miss Marple's thoughts were steady, her work done. In St. Mary Mead, a grocer's confession had restored peace, and here, in St. Mary's Bay, the truth had prevailed, woven from whispers, glimpses, and a spinster's unerring gaze. The trap had closed, and justice, like a well-knit shawl, was complete. Chapter 11. The Vision Explained. The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary's Bay in a golden haze, softening the edges of its whitewashed cottages and casting long shadows across the quay's worn stones. The village, though still abuzz with the shock of Philip Vernon's confession, seemed to exhale, its rhythm settling as the truth of Eleanor's death emerged from the shadows. The sea sparkled under a sky of deepening blue, its gentle lap against the shore a counterpoint to the murmurs of villagers gathered in knots, their voices a blend of awe and relief. Miss Jane Marple, her sprigged muslin dress exchanged for her light shawl against the evening's chill, sat in the Anchor Inn's lounge, a cup of tea cooling before her. Her knitting needles, resumed after yesterday's dramatic gathering, clicked softly, their rhythm as steady as her thoughts, which now turned to tying the case's final threads. Raymond West and Joan, seated across from her, were still reeling. From Philip's collapse, their earlier skepticism replaced by a mix of admiration and bewilderment. Raymond, his manuscript forgotten, leaned forward, his eyes bright with a writer's fascination. "Aunt Jane, that was positively theatrical. You had Vernon cornered like a character in a Doyle story. But how did you know he'd crack? And Mrs. Henshaw's vision, blood on the key. Was it real, or some artist's fancy?" Joan, her sketchpad open to a half-finished view of the cliffs, nodded eagerly. "Yes, Aunt Jane, explain it. I'm dying to understand how it all fits. The locket, the shawl, that awful blood." Miss Marple's lips twitched, her smile as gentle as the firelight flickering on the lounge's oak beams. "Patience, my dears," she said, her needles never faltering. "A mystery, like a piece of knitting, needs its loose ends tucked in. Let us begin with Mrs. Henshaw, whose vision was no fancy, but a glimpse of truth, seen through an artist's heart." She sipped her tea, her voice soft but deliberate. And the lounge, quiet save for the clink of Mr. Tuttle's glasses at the bar, seemed to lean in, as if the village itself awaited her explanation. She began with the key, that central stage, where Mrs. Henshaw's crimson stain had sparked the case. Mrs. Henshaw, you see, is a woman of keen observation, trained to capture the world's details in her sketches. That morning, before her vision, she saw Philip Vernon near the quay, wiping his hands, red, she thought, with blood. Her mind, shocked by the sight, painted it as a stain on the pavement, a symbol of guilt she could not yet name. But it was no hallucination. Philip, I believe, had cut his hand, perhaps in the struggle with Eleanor at the cove, or while handling the rocks to stage her fall. He washed the blood away in the sea, but not before Mrs. Henshaw's eye caught it, her artist's soul transforming a fleeting glimpse into a warning. Raymond frowned, his pen tapping his notebook. "But the pavement was clean, Aunt Jane. The boy Tuttle sent found nothing. How could she see blood that wasn't there?" Miss Marple's eyes crinkled, her tone patient. "The mind, Raymond, is a curious thing. It sees what it must, even if it dresses truth in strange garb. In St. Mary Mead, old Mrs. Bantry once saw a ghost in her garden, but it was only her maid sneaking to meet a lover. Mrs. Henshaw's vision was her mind's way of holding a truth too stark for words. Philip's guilt, marked in blood, washed away but not erased. Joan, her pencil poised, leaned closer. So the blood was real, but gone by the time anyone looked. That's chilling. And the locket, how did it fit?" Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap, her hands folding neatly. "The locket, my dear, was Philip's mistake, a small thing that betrayed his haste. Eleanor wore it that morning, a keepsake of her quieter days. In the struggle, or as he moved her body to stage the fall, it fell, lodging in a crevice where the tide's fingers could not reach. Philip, in his panic, did not notice, or could not retrieve it without risking discovery. Its survival was a silent witness, pointing to a death that was no accident." She paused, her gaze drifting to the window, where the quay lay serene, its stones unmarred. "Consider the shawl, too, seen by Mr. Crosby and young Billy. Philip, clever but not flawless, wore it to mimic Eleanor's silhouette, knowing distant eyes would assume her presence. The mist aided him, blurring details, but Billy's sharp sight caught the truth. A man's stride, too swift for Eleanor's careful steps. In St. Mary Mead, a boy's glimpse of a stranger unmasked a poacher. And here Billy's eyes helped unravel a killer's ruse. Raymond, scribbling notes, shook his head. "It's ingenious, Aunt Jane, but the insurance policy, that's the heart of it, isn't it? 20,000 uns and Philip's debts. How did you know it drove him?" Miss Marple's needles resumed, their click a soft underscore to her words. "Human nature, Raymond, is so predictable. Mr. Hargreaves spoke of Philip's anxiety, his questions about payouts, and Mrs. Phipps told of an argument, Eleanor resisting a plan she sensed was wrong. Philip's life in London, shadowed by financial missteps, followed him here, and the policy was his escape. A sum to clear his debts, perhaps to start anew. In my village, a tailor's sudden wealth led to his arrest for fraud, and Philip's motive was no less clear once the pieces aligned. Joan's eyes widened, her sketch forgotten. But the argument Tom Bragg heard, was that Philip and Eleanor too? And how did you make him confess? That gathering was like a play with you directing. Miss Marple chuckled, her voice warm. The argument, yes, was likely them, days before her death, as Philip pressed his plan and Eleanor resisted. As for the confession, fear is a great unraveller. The rumour we spread that a fisherman saw a man pushing a woman struck Philip's conscience like a needle through cloth. He knew his crime, and the village's whispers, coupled with Mrs. Henshaw's testimony, broke his resolve. In St. Mary Mead, a whispered hint of theft flushed out a culprit, and here fear did the same. She sipped her tea, her thoughts turning to Eleanor, whose quiet life had ended in betrayal. Poor Eleanor, she said softly, was a woman of strength, though she hid it, her reluctance to sign the policy, her flinches at Philip's touch, her solitary walks, all spoke of a heart burdened by suspicion. She sensed his desperation, perhaps even his intent, but love or duty kept her silent. Her locket, with her image inside, was her last stand, a token the sea could not claim. Raymond, closing his notebook, leaned back, his voice thoughtful. "It's almost tragic, isn't it? Philip, driven by debts, and Eleanor, caught in his trap. But how did you piece it all together, Aunt Jane? The vision, the locket, the shawl. It's like you saw the pattern before anyone else." Miss Marple's smile was faint, her eyes distant. "Patterns, my dear, are everywhere if you watch for them. A village is a small place, but its heart beats with truths, jealousy, greed, fear. I only listened, as I've always done, and let the threads weave themselves. In St. Mary Mead, a grocer's lie unravelled because I noticed his boots, and here Philip's guilt showed in his eyes, his hands, his haste. The lounge was emptying now, guests drifting to the quay or their rooms, but Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts on Mrs. Henshaw. She had visited the painter that morning, finding her calmer, her sketchbook open to a new drawing, a view of the cliffs, free of blood. "You gave me courage, Miss Marple," Mrs. Henshaw had said, her green eyes clear. "I thought I was mad, but you saw what I saw." Miss Marple had patted her hand, knowing an artist's truth was a fragile, precious thing, like a stitch, held just so. Joan, gathering her sketches, paused. "What happens now, Aunt Jane? Philip's arrested, but the village, will it ever be the same? Miss Marple's needles stilled, her gaze soft but steady. Villages, my dear, are resilient. They talk, they mourn, they heal. Philip will face trial, and Eleanor's memory will fade, but the key will remain, and the sea will keep its secrets. In St. Mary Mead, a scandal passed, and life went on, as it will here. Raymond, rising, stretched with a grin. You're a marvel, Aunt Jane. I'm half tempted to write this up, though no one would believe it. Shall we dine? I'm starved after all this sleuthing. Miss Marple laughed, tucking her knitting away. A little soup, perhaps, Raymond, but no more mysteries tonight. My needles need a rest. They left the lounge, the inn's warmth giving way to the evening's cool, and Miss Marple glanced at the key, its stones gleaming in the twilight. The vision, she knew, was explained, its blood a truth unveiled, and St. Mary's Bay, like her own village, would find its peace, woven from the quiet wisdom of a spinster's gaze. Chapter 12. The Quiet Village. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary's Bay, its rays piercing the last wisps of dawn mist to gild the village's cobbled lanes and thatched roofs. The sea, a shimmering expanse of silver blue, lapped softly against the quay, its rhythm a soothing balm after the storm of Philip Vernon's confession. The village, though still whispering of the tragedy that had unmasked a husband's greed, seemed to settle into a tentative calm, as if the truth, however bitter, had cleared the air. Miss Jane Marple stood in her room at the Anchor Inn, folding her sprigged muslin dresses into a small valise, her movements precise and unhurried. Her holiday, marred by murder, was drawing to a close, and the train to St. Mary Mead awaited, promising the familiar comforts of her cottage and garden. Downstairs, the lounge was a hive of activity, with guests exchanging farewells and Mr. Tuttle bustling about with trays of breakfast scones. Raymond West, his suitcase packed with manuscripts and a newfound respect for his aunt's acumen, lounged by the fire, regaling Joan with plans for a novel inspired by the Vernon case. Joan, her sketchpad filled with studies of the quay and cliffs, listened with half an ear, her eyes drifting to Miss Marple as she descended the stairs, her grey shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. "Aunt Jane," Joan called, waving her over. "You must tell us how you feel. Now it's all over. The village is calling you a heroine." Miss Marple's lips twitched, her smile as modest as the black hat perched atop her silver hair. "Nonsense, my dear," she said, settling into a chintz-covered chair. "I only listened, as I always do. Villages, you know, have a way of revealing their secrets, if one pays attention." Her knitting needles, produced from her bag, began their familiar click, a steady counterpoint to the lounge's hum. Raymond, setting aside his notebook, leaned forward, his voice earnest. "But, Aunt Jane, you did more than listen. You unravelled Philip Vernon like a plot twist. I'm still reeling. How did you know it would end with him confessing?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes crinkling behind gold-rimmed spectacles. "Human nature, Raymond, is a predictable thing once you see its patterns. Philip was a man pressed by debts, his charm a mask for desperation. His mistake was underestimating the village, its eyes, its ears, its memory. In St. Mary Mead, a grocer's boasts led to his downfall, and here Philip's fear betrayed him, stirred by a simple rumour, She paused, her needles moving with the grace of long practice, and her thoughts turned to the case's final pieces, now settled like a well-knit shawl. The village, she reflected, had played its part as surely as she had. Mrs. Phipps's gossip, sharp as her post-office stamps, had uncovered the insurance policy and Eleanor's unease. Mrs. Lyle's quiet observations had placed Philip at the cliffs by night, his restlessness a clue to his guilt. Young Billy's fleeting glimpse, Tom Bragg's overheard argument, and Mr. Crosby's faltering certainty had each added a thread, woven together by Miss Marple's patient hand. And Mrs. Henshaw, whose vision of blood had sparked the inquiry, had been the heart of it all, her artist's eye capturing a truth her mind could only paint in crimson. The locket, spared by the tide, had been the final stitch, a silent testament to a crime staged in haste. Joan, tracing a sketch of the key, looked up, her voice soft. "It's sad, isn't it, Aunt Jane? Eleanor, I mean. She seemed so alone, caught in Philip's schemes. Do you think she knew what he planned?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze drifting to the window, where the key lay serene, its stones gleaming in the sunlight. "I believe she did, my dear, in her heart. Her flinches, her reluctance to sign the policy, her solitary walks, they spoke of a woman who sensed danger but could not escape it. Love, or perhaps duty, held her fast, as it often does. In St. Mary Mead, a wife's silence hid her husband's theft, and Eleanor's was no less heavy." Raymond, scribbling a note, frowned. "And Philip? What happens to him now? The constable took him, but will he hang?" Miss Marple's expression grew sombre, her voice gentle but firm. "That is for the courts, Raymond. He will face trial, and the evidence, Mrs. Henshaw's testimony, the locket, his own words, will speak against him. Justice, you know, is a slow but steady thread. In my village, a farmer's trial restored peace, and I trust it will here, though it cannot bring Eleanor back." The lounge door opened, admitting Mrs. Henshaw, her auburn hair loosely pinned, her face brighter than Miss Marple had seen it. She carried a canvas, its edges still damp with paint, and approached with a shy smile. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice steady, "I wanted to show you this before you leave. It's the key, but different now. No blood, only light." She turned the canvas, revealing a scene of breathtaking clarity. The key's stones, wet with morning dew, reflected a sky of rose and gold, with gulls soaring above a tranquil sea. The painting held no trace of the crimson stain, as if the artist's heart had cleansed it with truth. Miss Marple's eyes softened, her hand resting lightly on Mrs. Henshaw's. "It's beautiful, my dear. You've captured the village's soul and your own strength. That vision of yours was a gift, you know, a warning that saved us from a lie." Mrs. Henshaw blushed, her fingers tracing the canvas's edge. "I thought I was losing my mind, but you believed me. I'm painting again, properly now, because of you." Miss Marple shook her head, her smile warm. "You believed yourself, Mrs. Henshaw. An artist's eye is a rare thing, and yours saw what mattered." As Mrs. Henshaw left, promising to visit the inn later, Raymond leaned back, his grin wide. "You're collecting admirers, Aunt Jane. First the village, now the artist. I'll have to write you as a detective yet." Miss Marple laughed, a soft musical sound. "Write what you like, Raymond, but leave me to my knitting. It's far less trouble than mysteries. Joan, closing her sketchpad, stood, her voice brisk. "Come, let's walk to the station. The train won't wait, and I want one last look at the quay." Miss Marple agreed, tucking her knitting into her bag, and the trio stepped into the village, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The quay was alive with its daily hum. Fishermen hauling nets, children chasing crabs, a woman selling flowers from a cart. Miss Marple paused, her eyes tracing the pavement where Mrs. Henshaw's vision had appeared. No blood marred its surface, only the glint of sunlight on wet stones, and she felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing the truth had cleansed it as surely as the tide. The village, she thought, would heal, its gossip turning to harvests and weddings, Eleanor's tragedy a memory softened by time. In St. Mary Mead, a scandal had faded thus, and St. Mary's Bay, with its resilient heart, would do the same. And the station, a small platform bordered by wildflowers, the train puffed steam, its whistle sharp in the morning air. Raymond, carrying Miss Marple's valise, was chastened but cheerful, his earlier doubts replaced by a vow to trust his aunt's instincts. "I'll never scoff again, Aunt Jane," he said, handing her a ticket. "You've outdone every sleuth I've read. Any advice for a would-be detective?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her voice light but pointed. "Listen, my dear, and look. People tell their stories in the smallest things. A glance, a pause, a polished shoe. And never underestimate a village. It's never as quiet as it seems." Joan hugged her, her sketchpad tucked under her arm. "I'll miss you, Aunt Jane. Come back next summer, without a murder, I hope." Miss Marple chuckled, stepping onto the train, her shawl adjusted with care. "We shall see, Joan. Mysteries, you know, have a way of finding me." The whistle blew, and the train lurched forward, carrying her from the quay, the cliffs, and the village that had briefly claimed her. As St. Mary's Bay receded, its rooftops a patchwork against the sea, Miss Marple settled into her seat, her thoughts already turning to St. Mary Mead, where her roses awaited, and perhaps another puzzle lurked in the quiet lanes. The carriage rocked gently, and she opened her knitting bag, her needles resuming their dance. The case of Eleanor Vernon, with its blood-stained vision and hidden greed, was closed, its truth woven from the village's whispers and a spinster's unerring gaze. She thought of Philip, facing justice, and Mrs. Henshaw, painting anew, and felt the balance restored, as it always was when truth prevailed. In St. Mary Mead, a lost ring had mended a village's trust, and here a locket had done the same, its gold a beacon in the tide's embrace. As the train wound through green hills, Miss Marple's knitting grew, a soft blue shawl taking shape under her hands. The world, she knew, was full of patterns, of secrets waiting to be seen, and she was ready, as ever, to meet them with her quiet wisdom and her needle's steady song.